name is Mohammed Rustom, and this semester I'm a senior research fellow here at the Institute. I'm currently also an associate professor of Islamic studies in Ottawa, in Canada. In many ways, my research, it spans between like the 11th century and the 17th century. So I tend to look at the Islamic philosophical and intellectual tradition in that time period, about 700 years. And I began to investigate that area, and I discovered there's this one author. He lived in the 12th century. He died in the 1131 of the Common Era. His name was al-Qudat Hamadani, or in Persian, al-Qudat Hamadani. The primary goal was to come up with a proper biographical account of the man's life and times and the political context for why he was killed. Then the second part was, all right, what are his ideas? Was he a heretic, like some people said? If he was a heretic, how did a heretic become one of the leading Islamic judges in a major city in the Islamic world? So some things didn't really jive so well in terms of the traditional narratives. The third part is, how do we make sense of it? And that's largely what my research project at the Institute here is concerned with. It's concerned with studying his most important Arabic book that he wrote, because he wrote, as I said, in Persian, but he wrote a couple of very important books in Arabic. And this is a book that he wrote, as he says, in his youth. So if he was 34 years old, how young could he have been when he wrote this book? He was 24. He was 24 years old when he wrote this book, and he wrote it in 3 days. In many ways, the greatest challenge, I think, was that he had like two modes of discourse. He was a spiritual guide to many people. So disciples used to come to him for spiritual instruction, and he wouldn't write his advice to people, but he would just, speak it. Then there were his other writings, which are actually formal writings. So not just oral discourses, but actual formal letters that he wrote to his disciples. He wrote about 162 letters, which is a lot. The epistolary art wasn't developed by the 12th century. And again, he's one of the first authors in the history of Islamic civilization, especially in Persian, to write so many correspondences to his students, which have all been preserved. And the third is just his prose in general. It's very unique in the history of Islamic writings. Many scholars of Persian and Arabic literature have noted that they haven't really seen an author who writes like this. It's hard to explain, but it's writing, but he's clearly jumping out at every page, and it seems very different. In intellectual Iranian circles in Persia, so Iran and Central Asia, his Persian works were very well known. Right into India, many of the Indian Sufi authors into the 19th century were quoting him, and he was like a household figure in many ways. And his temperament fits in very well with the South Asian Indian temperament in terms of the writing and the rhetoric and things like this. But also in the Arabic region, from North Africa into Spain and large parts of the Arabic-speaking world, like today the Levant, his Arabic book, this one that I'm working on right now, was read and studied and translated sometimes into other languages right into the 17th century. It is even said that his book was translated into Ottoman Turkish at one point, and many major Arabic reformers in the 18th and 19th century were citing this book as a very good example of, if you're going to deal with the discipline of philosophy, how to do it without losing sight on the mystical vision of things. Because these authors in this period, they were very much concerned with preserving the life of the mind, but also cultivating the spiritual life. And they've seen this particular Arabic book as making a strong case for that, because he has a doctrine, which is the main one in this text I'm working on. It has to do with, it's called that which lies beyond the scope of the intellect. The fellowship I've only been here for 2 months, but it's been extremely instrumental in allowing me to further my project. The first step is that it provided me with this beautiful space to meet different colleagues. Many colleagues in the different programs, Arab Crossroads program and the philosophy program, have demonstrated a great interest in this project that I'm working on. So I've been invited to present on certain workshops already. Professor Ganeri is running a workshop in December. He called The Virtues of Attention. So I'm actually presenting there on this fellow, al-Qudat, and his doctrine of love as it relates to attention, which is the theme of the workshop. And again, it ties right into the book that I'm dealing with, where he brings in attentiveness through meditation as the way of transcending yourself. My own workshop, of course, which is on the theme of rationality and language in Islamic thought, it does what I've always considered to be like the true hallmark of like any serious intellectual pursuit, which is that it has to be interdisciplinary. And I've always insisted that, you know, if you look at these authors in the classical tradition, as is the case in many other religious civilizations, they were real interdisciplinarians. Like this al-Qudat, who was such a young man, he was a master of philosophy, scripture, poetry, theology. If he lived longer, he probably would have been a physician too. This was just the way they, you know, this is the way they worked. They would astronomy. And this is something that is lost often on contemporary educators and students, which is the manner in which all these different disciplines in the humanities and the sciences really tie together. So my workshop was a way of like bringing in these different disciplines in their particularities, bringing them into the general kind of conversation. My guy, al-Qudat, fits into that framework, but there's many other authors who belong to centuries just before and after who do the same. And in many ways, the workshop, it's like a micro version of like the greater macrocosm, which is NYUAD, which is specifically concerned with this interdisciplinary approach, and which is what has attracted me initially to applying for the fellowship. I really think that this venue has provided me with the means and the ability to meet different people who are like-minded, but also to kind of expand my own horizons and see how this question of interdisciplinarity ties into so many other areas that I'm concerned with, especially as it relates to my project. What I'd like it to say is I'd like it to highlight two things. One, that it's the first critical translation of this text and study of it. But the reason it's important is because it's the first book in Islamic civilization. And actually in many, it's probably one of the earliest books in pre-modern civilization to try to attempt to fuse a middle ground between the discipline of philosophy and mysticism. They often are seen as a kind of antithetical. You know, like Bertrand Russell in his famous book, Logic and Mysticism, he says that these two they can't come together. You know, a logician is, by definition, somebody who can't be a mystic, but he never defines what a mystic is. And these authors in the Islamic tradition, none of them ever had really a problem with the concept of mysticism as such. They just didn't call it mysticism. They called it tasting, they called it wayfaring, they called it inner purification. And the philosophers in the Islamic tradition used the same language and they had the same concerns. So if the blurb can capture something about how this is the first, you know, one of the first pre-modern books in Islamic civilization and global civilization, that makes a case for the coherence of these two seemingly antithetical disciplines.